All right, welcome back. We are on our last mini lesson of chapter 10. So this is going to be a short one, just covering a couple slides focused on the characteristics of cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. And we've seen some of these characteristics before because you learned them in histology chapter 4. But here we're just going to bring some of those facts back and compare it to our now better understanding of skeletal muscle tissue. So we're going to start with cardiac muscle. So just some key characteristics, things that you might already be familiar with, is cardiac muscle tissue is striated and it is branched in its shape, and it's typically uninucleate. It is also involuntary. So those are just kind of just name tags if you want to put on cardiac muscle. So it's striated, branched, uninucleate, and involuntary. So what are some similarities? What are things that it shares with skeletal muscle? Well, the main thing that you should be picking up is the striations. So if you remember, for skeletal muscle, striations were caused by the organization of the thin and thick filaments into the A bands and the I bands within the sarcomere. So if cardiac muscle has striations, then you should be able to come to the conclusion that it also has myofibrils, sarcomeres, all of the organization of the thick and thin filaments, and you would be correct. So the striations in cardiac muscle are due to the same reasons they are in skeletal muscle, the organization of the muscle fibers themselves. However, within the cell, there are some differences. So if you take a look down here, we can see there are some T-tubules, so that's the same, but look at the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's not as beefy, it doesn't look as thick, and there are no terminal cisternae and there's no triads. So the amount of calcium isn't quite as abundant as what you're going to be seeing in skeletal muscle, because kind of think about the function, right? So here's another opportunity to make that structure and function connection. So in skeletal muscle, you have to move those muscles pretty quick. They are your locomotion. So you're moving quickly to move and to get out of the way or to, do some kind of activity. Usually quickly. Your heart is just a regular beating kind of thing. It's endurance muscle of the greatest kind. And so you don't really need these big bursts of calcium to be dumping over your zones of overlap. You can have a continual kind of flow of calcium when it's needed. So those are kind of some similarities and differences. It has T-tubules, it has sarcoplasmic reticulum, it has striations, it has myofibrils, it has all of those things, but they're just organized slightly differently for the cardiac muscle because it does a different job. Another thing that you'll see, and maybe you saw in the histology, is cardiac muscle has these what we call intercalated discs. Okay, these little lines kind of going in the same orientation as the striations. So these are what we call intercalated discs, which are connections between neighboring cells that allow for ions to flow, specifically calcium ions. So when we get into 232, when we learn about cardiac muscle physiology, we'll see this again. But basically, it allows calcium to flow from one cell to the next. So it's part of the whole physiology of contraction of a cardiac muscle. Okay. Another characteristic, a physiology characteristic of cardiac muscle is it cannot do tetanus. So the nature of its contraction cycle prevents the cardiac muscle cells to ever reach tetanus. Remember, tetanus was the stimuli is coming so fast that the muscle just stays contracted. Well, cardiac muscle, that wouldn't ever be good for your heart, because if it's contracted in tetanus, it isn't beating, and for your heart to work properly, it has to be beating to pump the blood everywhere. So we'll again see that when we get into 232 next term in our heart muscle physiology and the cardiovascular system. But for right now, you just need to kind of pin that as a fact on cardiac muscle tissue, is it cannot reach tetanus. So it always has the ability to relax in between the frequency of the stimuli. And the last characteristic of cardiac muscle, it is not directly stimulated by the nervous system. It can be regulated by the nervous and endocrine system. So you can speed up your heart rate and you can slow down your heart rate either by nerve impulses or by hormones, but neither of those things actually generate the signal for contraction. It is what we call automaticity, set up by pacemaker cells. So the heart itself, even if it was outside of the body, if you could give it enough oxygen, it would beat on its own. It does not need direct nervous or endocrine signals for it to beat. which is pretty cool. Okay, so those are our comparisons between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. Then we can take a look at smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is named smooth muscle because of the obvious lack of striations. So what that should tell you is that there are no myofibrils or sarcomeres or the organizations of the A bands and the I bands. It does have thick and thin filaments though. So you do have zones of overlap. They're just kind of randomly distributed throughout the cell. So they're calling the actin, they're calling it actin, but that's our thin filament, and myosin, that's our thick filament. But you have zones of overlap, but they're just kind of distributed all over the cell. The good thing about the reason why that works for smooth muscle is now we got to go back a little bit to our length tension relationships. So if you remember, if we stretched our sarcomeres so far in a skeletal muscle, we wouldn't be able to produce tension, or if it was so close together, we wouldn't be able to produce tension. And we had that regulated by our skeleton and our connective tissue. So that works good for skeletal muscle. But think about where smooth muscle is found. Smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of hollow organs. Think about some of your hollow organs, your intestines, your stomach, your urinary bladder, the uterus. So these are all organs that can change their shape, sometimes on a daily basis. So when your stomach is empty, the cells are all kind of close together, but they still want to be able to produce contractions. And then you eat a large meal and your stomach is now enlarged and all this smooth muscle is stretched, but we still want to be able to produce contractions. So the ability to produce tension or contractions over long or various lengths of the muscle fiber is what we call plasticity in smooth muscle tissue. So if our smooth muscle cells are stretched far because our tummies are full, we can still produce tension. If our stomach is empty, we can still produce tension. If our urinary bladder is full, we can still produce tension. If it's empty, we can still produce tension. So having the ability to produce tension over wide lengths serves smooth muscle very well, just because the nature of where it is and what it's supposed to do is found in the wall of hollow organs. Okay. All right. Yeah, so no T-tubules, no myofibrils, no sarcomeres, spindle-shaped cells. So spindle is kind of this shape here, uninucleate, single nucleus. And then for the functionality, the physiology, it does, since it doesn't have a sarcoplasmic reticulum, it gets calcium typically from the extracellular space, so calcium moves in from the outside. It is also controlled differently. So where every skeletal muscle had a motor neuron communicating to it, in smooth muscle, you don't have to. You can have a muscle fiber, like a neuron, sorry. You can have a motor neuron come in and communicate to this cell, but then via gap junctions, that signal can pass to the neighboring cell. So each cell doesn't have to have a direct neural connection, but in skeletal muscle, it does. Okay, so that wraps it up. So not a lot of characteristics for smooth muscle, but just enough to have see the differences between smooth and skeletal muscle. All right, that's it. We wrapped up chapter 10. So just a couple words. Hopefully you'll have started working on your muscle list. Will be posting some videos on kind of tours of our muscle models so you can get a feel for the muscles, their actions, origins, and insertions to help you learn and study your muscle list. All right, have a good day. I'll see you next time. Bye.